Hey, this is Enaa, and today I want to talk about the influences on me as a historian. That means, as a historian, who are the thinkers who have influenced me? You can probably guess at least two of them, but this list is completely subjective, and it's the people I've come back to in research, in my thinking, and I probably would change it a little now because I wrote this more than a year ago when I was preparing my personal defense for a portfolio that I used to finish graduate school. But I thought I may as well share it with you. And this list would be a little different than if I was doing, say, direct political activism. Certain people do not make this list as for my historical list. Lenin and Mao, for instance, don't, although they would rank very high on any political list. Some people would obviously cross over, but these are the people I use when I'm trying to develop theories, my thoughts, when I'm actually writing papers. And the top two are obviously Marx and Engels. Dialectical materialism is absolutely foundational for me, looking at different class societies and their contradictions, and the totality of these of a class society and how these different elements interact is incredibly important. And of course, not just that, but how to analyze capitalism and how socialism may come about. So, obviously, as a historian, I've spent a lot of time looking at revolutions and revolutionary movements. And anyway, from them, another thinker who's obviously been influential to me is Leon Trotsky. And the notion of combined and uneven development was a really creative adaptation for Marxism for me, especially when I first read it. And his book, The History of the Russian Revolution, which I remember buying for about 50 cents, best deal I ever got, because you have to spend like 30 bucks for it, was a really great sweeping narrative. It's one of my favorite history books, and he shows me what a Marxist historian can be, and just the level of his writing, and I love that. And something he did in a way more than Marx, because I was influenced by Trotsky before Marx, in a sense, was his writings on the USSR, especially the Revolution Betrayed. He got past the form. The Soviet Union said it was socialist. Well, he looked underneath and he looked at the content. Like, does this really add up? And that's something I've always carried with me. So when someone says to me, North Korea is a progressive Marxist state, I'm like, they must also be a democratic state because they actually say they are. You try and look underneath like what people are saying, and that's something that I've always tried to do, especially as a historian. The fourth influence on my thinking is Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci's theory of hegemony and how the bourgeois maintain their rule through a combination of coercion and consent. It was really like having cold water thrown on my face. It seems so obvious, but it was just it was a great insight. And his looking at the civil society and the various institutions therein, and the development of worldviews and common sense among the masses, and the idea of how a ruling bloc maintains control through civil society, and again, the idea of consent. And he really kind of got through this whole economic determinism. I remember the first time I read the prison notebooks, and I don't think I really understood most of it, but I finished it, and I read it again, and then I finished it then, and a few weeks later, I read it a third time, and I've since go back to it. He's a constant influence on my thought, someone I really get a lot out of. The next one is probably, you could argue, the only non-Marxist on this list, and someone he's just influenced my thinking immensely is Edward Said. He was a Palestinian literary critic, and he taught me to think about imperialism and domination in a multitude of ways. He wrote Orientalism, fantastic book, and he looked at how culture and literature highlight the importance of domination, and like how a dominant power through the medium of the writer represents the non-dominant people as a non-civilized, childlike, or in another or another form, like just degrading manner, and just how texts are just embedded in their historical context. And now, obviously, he was writing about the Middle East and Arabs and Islam, and that's influenced my thinking in that area. But I did an incredible amount of research on Ireland as an undergraduate, a little less as a graduate. So the way Irish have been perceived, for instance, through British eyes, I've always referred back to Said, always. And for the record, I support a unified Irish socialist republic. The last one, and I probably would bump him off now, but he was really influential in me in graduate school, was Walter Benjamin. He was kind of on the periphery of the Frankfurt School in the 20s and the 30s. And his influence largely stems on the theses on the philosophy of history, which really isn't that long. I think there might be 11 or 12 of them, I forget now. But he looks at how each document of civilization, whether literary or otherwise, is really at the same time a document of barbarism. Like the great Roman buildings were constructed by a slave society, and we look at how these documents are transmitted through history, and he really looks at brushing against the grain, and his idea of progress, of course, the great leaps in production, but it is also a storm that ravages toiling classes. And these are just some of the thinkers. And when I originally came up with this list, I had more. And when I actually wrote it out, I had to, of course, condense it. And even then, I was told not to give the committee that was judging me a lesson in Marxism. So I really had to shorten it. I probably would bump Benjamin off now just because I haven't used him since graduate school. That's not to say he's not an important thinker who you should obviously read. He is. Other people I would put on now, or I would definitely consider, and it's just, these are my personal examples, people I go back to. Howard Zinn. I love his People's History. I have some criticisms of it, but it's still an immense read. Edward P. Thompson, he's Making the English Working Class, fantastic work. Zev Sternhell, actually, his politics are really a lot different from mine, and I don't agree with a lot of his conclusions. He wrote Neither Left Nor Right about the development of French fascism, other books on French fascism. He wrote on the founding of Israel, or the founding myths of Israel, and he is a Zionist, but he as a historian, I find myself enjoying the arguments I've had with him through his work. Someone else who's obviously been influential is actually Mike Davis. He's a third campus Trotskyist. He wrote Prisoners of the American Dream, one of my favorite books on the development of the American working class. He also wrote Planet of the Slums, City of Quartz, and In Praise of Barbarians. I love his work, love his writing. Arno Mayer. He wrote The Persistence of the Ancient Regime. Typically Marxists argue that Europe was largely capitalist in 1914. But Mayer, who is also a Marxist, argues that Europe was largely controlled by the aristocracy in 1914. At first, I didn't really agree with this thesis, and I didn't really explore his work, but I've been very influenced by it. He's a revisionist historian in the best sense. And that is, he challenges your interpretation, or the standard interpretation, based on the available facts, and he looks at everything in a new light. He also wrote some book on the Holocaust called Why the Heavens Did Not Darken. Another great book, The Furies, which is a comparison of the French and the Russian revolutions, and From Swords to Plowshares, which looks at Israel-Palestine. And Eric Hobsbawm, I think his politics are messed up. He's kind of like a social democrat, but he writes great history, if nothing else. Isaac Deutscher, of course. His Trotsky trilogy was immensely influential. And a last one I definitely should add, because he probably wrote the greatest single book on a living revolution I've ever read, and that's William Hinton's Fanshan. I couldn't put it down when I read it. It's a fantastic book. It deals with peasant land reform in revolutionary China. Great book. There's obviously others. I can't name them all, but these are just some of the people who've influenced my theory and practice as a historian. Some of them obviously would carry over to more activist-oriented work, but if I'm alone in a library, these are some of the books I'd want with me. So this is Enaa. Until next time.